Welcome back. You're still watching Smart Markets right here on ET Now, and we have a special guest.
Yes, we do. Let's take it straight then. Without wasting any more time, Alastair Newton joins in right here on the show, live from Mumbai, actually. Mr. Newton, good evening. Thanks so much for taking time out for us. First, we have to ask you, this resounding victory for Donald Trump, did it take you by surprise? Are you now repricing the risks that this brings with it?
Well, I'm not repricing any risks at the moment, but this result is certainly something of a surprise. The opinion polls have been telling us something very different for the last few days, but there always was a significant probability of a Trump victory. And I do think actually that there's been a great deal of thought done by the commentariat, people like myself, and by market participants as to what this could imply. The problem, of course, is that we actually don't have much to go on from Mr. Trump himself, having run a pretty policy-like campaign.
Right. No, but Alastair, even though the world is grappling with the shock, so to speak, despite the thumping majority that he's won with in the United States, what does this really mean for policy making going forward into the future? Because that's the key imponderable, that's the conundrum that everybody's kind of trying to wrap their heads around.
Quite right, and I think we need to be very careful about jumping to conclusions right now. First of all, Mr. Trump will have to appoint his key executives. There's some ideas about who some of those may be, but obviously there's a lot of work to be done on that. Secondly, I'm sure we will get some clearer ideas over the coming days of where he might wish to take the US. But the important thing to keep in mind is that on the 21st of January, when he gets into the Oval Office for his first full working day as president, he's going to have only one top priority. And that priority is the same priority as every first-term president in the US. How do I get re-elected in 4 years' time? And I think if we consider that, the first thing we have to add to that is that he will not get re-elected if he breaks all of his pre-election promises. And there is a huge weight of expectation on his shoulders from the Americans who voted for him. And we know what a lot of their sentiment has been. It's been anti-China, anti-globalization, make America great again, bring jobs back to America. And I think what markets need to focus on principally is the risk that in the name of so-called fair trade, Donald Trump is very likely indeed, in my view, to bring in measures which some would call protectionist and which would certainly risk a trade war. And clearly his two principal targets are likely to be Mexico, where we've already seen a significant peso sell-off today, and China. Now, last July, I did a lot of work on what the president can actually do without congressional approval, because even though President Trump will have a Republican majority in both houses of Congress, Congress will likely still act as something of a constraint on him. What he can do is actually quite far-reaching. First of all, he can withdraw the US from international treaties. So clearly that puts NAFTA at risk. I think we can reasonably assume that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will not now be ratified. No doubt that will be very welcome in Beijing. And that we can also assume that he will almost certainly withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Change Accord, no doubt to the dismay of the COP22 participants who are meeting in Morocco at the moment. And that, of course, has some very serious implications for the world and indeed for investors who will look at energy markets in a different way if the US withdraws from that treaty. As far as trade itself is concerned, he can declare China a currency manipulator. He can use the International Trade Commission to impose swingeing tariffs, and there's a case before the ITC at the moment on Chinese steel, and he can impose 15% emergency tariffs on imports for up to 150 days without congressional approval. Beyond that, he can also use executive orders. The limits of executive orders are not clear. Both Barack Obama and his predecessor, George W. Bush, have pushed the envelope on those. So my bottom line, and probably the thing markets need to worry about most, is that President Trump may well start trade wars which have reverberations throughout the whole global economy.
Mr. Newton, are you not convinced at all with the conciliatory note that we saw him strike today at his victory speech? Because, you know, the presidential candidate, Donald Trump, that we know was very different from the president-elect. Didn't you think so?
Well, I wasn't convinced, to be honest. It's a day when he can bask in a certain amount of pride of what he's achieved. He's outmaneuvered all the pundits. He's surprised everybody consistently throughout this election. I think when he gets into office and starts thinking about getting re-elected and some of the promises he's made, as I said a moment ago, he is going to have to deliver on some of those. And I do think that trade is one area where he can act and will act. He seems to genuinely believe that this is the right thing to do for America, and I think he will do it. From my perspective, a lot of the things that I've just suggested to you he could and I think probably will do are actually counterproductive. They will damage the American economy as well and not necessarily be conducive to him winning a second term come 2020. But that's not the way he seems to look at the world, and certainly a lot, if not the majority of the people who voted for him will expect him to deliver on his trade promises.
Absolutely. Tell us how do you rationalize the market reaction after a gap down open, the way the markets have come back? Has that also surprised you? Because it has been a day of surprises and shocks. And tying into that, you know, what does his appointment mean for emerging markets? Because so far the brokerage calls that we are getting from market circles are indicating that, you know, they think this is great for the US, but not so great for emerging markets, for EMs.
Well, I think there's two ways of looking at that. I mean, clearly I'm not a market strategist, so I'm simply going to borrow from what I've been reading from people more expert than I am. First of all, I think it would be fair to say that obviously risk aversion has likely gone up a bit. That's potentially negative for at least some emerging markets. On the other hand, there is a view out there among strategists that maybe this is going to slow down the hand of the Fed raising rates. And the consensus on the case of a Clinton victory was that the Fed would raise rates in December, and that would be negative for emerging markets. Now, clearly the emerging market, which you're most interested in, and I'm most interested in, certainly at the present time, is India. And I would stress that I do think that, at least relative to others in the emerging market family, India is relatively immune to the impact of a Trump presidency, be it good or bad for emerging markets. I think that India will continue to be judged mainly on its fundamentals. I heard you playing a clip earlier which your interviewee suggested that Mr. Trump had said very little about India. That is correct. I mean, the one thing he has said is that he sees India as a bulwark against Islamic terrorism emanating from Pakistan. And of course, all of us sitting here in Mumbai this evening are well aware of that threat. There is a possibility that India may get somehow caught up in Trump trade measures because of the large amount of business processing which is done in this country for America. But I think Trump's primary aim is actually going to be at manufacturing. But again, lots of uncertainty. Markets clearly have reacted, knee-jerk, recalibrated, adjusted back a little bit more. We'll see how the dust settles over the course of the next few weeks. And I do think actually that for most of the world, the big question tomorrow morning will not be Trump presidency, but what is the Fed going to do in December?
And so what is the Fed going to do? Let's keep that as our last question. Do you suspect that a rate hike in December is very much on the table?
I think the Fed seems pretty enthusiastic about that, and if markets have bounced back and remain bounced back, then I think the Fed probably will go. I think the bigger question about the Fed is whether Janet Yellen will go or not at the end of this term, because clearly she doesn't seem to be on Donald Trump's Christmas card list.
Leave it at that.
So my bet is that we will still get a rate rise from the Fed in December, but as I say, you really need to talk to a market strategist about that.
All right, Alastair. Always a pleasure chatting with you, though. Alastair Newton there, joining in live right here on this special edition of Smart Markets, making sense of the chaos.
Thank you very much indeed.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.